English language work. If you did not give me your OED paper, you can give it to me after class. I'd like to introduce you to Professor Lottie, Professor Ruth Lottie, who has come here from University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And she, as you all know, gave us a story to read, and all of you history of the language people get a little relief from grammar and get to talk about a story. So, Professor Lottie.
Thank you all for being here today. And also thank you in advance for reading the story that we looked at for today. We're going to get more into it, but I know it was a really difficult story for a lot of reasons. And so we'll work through that together. So, as Dr. Clemens mentioned, this class that I'm going to run today is a little bit of a snippet of a class that I teach over at University of Massachusetts. It's an intro-level literature class on American war fiction. So today we're going to kind of make a segue from the history of the language into the world of American literature and think along those lines. So the first thing that I would like you all to do is to get out a piece of paper and something to write with. I know that a 1:30 class can be kind of hard because it's right after lunch. We may need to wake our brains up a little bit. I want us to start thinking about the idea of literature, representation, how it's maybe different than other forms of writing. So take a couple minutes and generate some thoughts about the following prompt. Besides being in a class like this, why would you ever choose to read a work of literature about war? Okay, so what are some differences between reading a literary text about war and reading a history book about war? What are those experiences like? How are they different? So if you're reading about war from a historical perspective, how is that different from reading about literature of war? What kinds of different information about the past do you get? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes just to think about that question, and I'll show you and we'll share our responses. Throw out some ideas. What did you guys write down in terms of differences for you? What did you learn from war literature that you perhaps don't learn from other texts? Yes?
So one of the differences, I think, between reading like a literary text or a history book is that with a history book, it often tends to be very unopinionated, very factual, and at times clinical. Whereas with a literary text, you get more of a personal narrative about it. You get to see more opinions, more drama, and it just feels a lot more relatable at times, even if it is biased.
Right, okay. So I'm hearing, and your name is?
Tim?
Tim, thank you, Tim. There's some others. Thank you. So you said more details, right, in terms of literature. You said maybe more opinionated?
Yeah.
Right, okay, great.
Ruth, I put some black ones down on the table.
Okay. And sorry, it's a little dark back here too. I hear that in about 10 minutes the lights are going to pop up on us. So guys come up with? What are some big differences? Yeah, and your name is?
Regina.
Regina? Great.
I think it shows like the emotions that people go through in war, whereas the history book is just more about the facts.
Textbooks tend to be very general, not specific. As literature, it can get really specific and personal.
Great. And your name was?
CJ.
CJ. Great, thank you.
And I think going off of how it gives you an emotional point of view, it helps you like empathize with the people going through it and maybe like understand how serious of a thing war is, how important it is to think about what you're doing.
Excellent, great. And your name is? Brittany, great. Yeah, Brittany, you're bringing up the reader's response, perhaps, to the text. Excellent point. Did I see other hands over here? Yes.
A lot of people read books about war because that's as close as they'll get to war. Some of the selected amount of people go.
Okay, great. Okay. So it's an outsider's perspective, maybe?
Yeah,
Or?
they're aware of the war.
Right, okay. So I'll kind of rephrase that as like gives insight.
Yeah.
Okay, and your name is?
Morgan.
Morgan, thank you, Morgan. Okay, excellent. So, nice job with the prompt. You're getting at the ideas that I'm really trying to bring up here in terms of some of the differences between what a literary narrative does about the past versus, especially in regard to war, and what perhaps a history book might teach you or other forms of narratives that you might read in other classes. And for our time together today, my goals are to think about a couple things. Number one, I want to think about the history, and excavate this a bit with you, the history of trauma. How many of you guys have heard the term trauma before? Yes, okay. It is a term that's used all over our culture today, and I want to kind of reach back and think about it from a historical perspective, how this specific term emerged. Secondly, I want to think about what challenges traumatic experience presents to representation in literature. And then three, we're going to use that to kind of catapult into the text and think about how what we've learned about traumatic experience might be shaping the narrative that you've all read today. It may give us a handle on some of the more difficult things going on in Ryan's text. Okay? So what we're going to do right now, just to link this to what you guys just did, is think about these things like the empathy, the emotions, the human dynamic. What is it in war literature specifically? And I'm going to argue that in a lot of ways, trauma is what informs that personal experience in war literature and is coming through so strongly. Okay, so just to move back in time a little bit in terms of how do we get this term trauma, where does this come from? Interestingly, well, the word trauma itself derives from the Greek word wound, which kind of brings up the idea that trauma itself is both a wounding of the body, right? You guys have probably heard this in medical language. Someone has a car accident, they have head trauma, things like that. But then we've also come to understand it as a psychic trauma, or something that happens inside our bodies that's maybe not visible from the outside. So this interplay between the ideas of bodily injury and psychic or psychological injury is something that's kind of structured our understanding over time. And this emerges during the latter half of the 1800s. And can anyone tell me what we're seeing here? Can you guys see the photo okay? What is this? Just yell it out. It's a train. Excellent, okay. It's kind of hard to make out what this picture is. I had a great picture of a locomotive, but then I really wanted the drama of this picture. And what's happening to this train? It's crashed, it's derailed. One of the things that we often forget about in our present moment is how radically new technologies like the train were for the people during the 1800s. And this, I think this picture was taken later, but the idea of trauma actually emerged as something called railway spine back in the 1860s, specifically a British doctor who started noticing that all of these people who were in these train crashes that happened were exhibiting these memory lapses, bodily tics, things like that that weren't apparent from physical external injury, but that seemed to be caused by some kind of psychic internal injury. And so this was a very kind of controversial topic. Dr. Erickson was his name, for those of you guys who want to associate a name with him. In 1867, developed the idea of railway spine. And it immediately became this idea that everybody in the medical community, particularly in Europe, were fascinated with. How is it that this physical experience is leading to these mental or psychological developments? The other thing to note about this is that there were very strongly class-oriented dynamics with who got diagnosed with railway spine and who didn't. So for instance, lower class people, if they were trying to claim that they had railway spine, they were cast under suspicion, and doctors thought, oh, they just want to sue the railroad companies to get money. So the viable candidate for railway spine was the richer, wealthier person. And these class dynamics continue to play out in how trauma evolves and whose trauma is seen in the war experience as well. So from its kind of original railway spine definition, trauma is taken up by this guy. Can anyone tell me who that is? Anyone know? Any psychology majors in there? Yeah, was it Tim?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sigmund Freud.
Yes, great, Sigmund Freud. Famous, of course, for psychoanalysis. And he takes up the idea of war trauma very early on. So he's connecting these ideas of railway spine, of what he calls war neuroses, and specifically attaches them to what he starts to see in World War I veterans. Okay? In the Civil War, the American Civil War that is, there were similar ideas of trauma in relation to war, or war trauma in the Civil War was known as soldier's heart. So there's kind of a history of the way that this term has developed over time in relation to war, soldier's heart, during the Civil War, war neurosis, shell shock is probably one you all have heard in relationship to the Great War, World War I, that then transitions from World War II kind of into the Vietnam era, into combat fatigue syndrome. So lots of similar reactions in terms of issues with memory, bodily tics, re-experiencing of events, feelings of helplessness, right? For those of you all who are familiar with the idea of PTSD, this is probably ringing a bell in terms of some of the same symptoms. And I put this painting up here. One of my favorite artists, John Singer Sargent. Anyone ever heard John Singer Sargent? Show of hands. Okay, great. An American painter who lived abroad, and he did this painting in 1919, Aghast, which depicts American and British soldiers in World War I on the Western Front, so in France. And they had just been gassed with mustard gas, which was used by the German Empire at that time. Since 1993, mustard gas is actually one of the chemical weapons, classified as a chemical weapon as we understand it today. So I really liked this picture because it's getting at something about perceiving war that I want to link to in the Tim O'Brien text. What do you notice about all these guys? For those of you especially who are in the front.
They can't see their eyes.
Yes, they've got their eyes bandaged. So there's something about limited perception going on in this painting that John Singer Sargent really wanted to express. And then I think, again, returns to those ideas of bodily injury and how that affects the senses, or what we understand about war. So to carry us through into the PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, when did this all come about? During the Vietnam War, the returning soldiers were much more politically active and were advocating for themselves. They joined the ongoing social movements within the United States, such as the women's movement and the civil rights movement, to gain recognition for the fact that they were coming home from the Vietnam War severely traumatized, right? We're seeing some of this happen in the story that you guys read for today. So to kind of capture the Vietnam era here. You guys are probably all familiar with Vietnam Veterans Memorial, of course, in DC, the wall with all the names inscribed. This is also there at the site of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. It's the Vietnam Women's Memorial, and it was commissioned and created by Glenna Goodacre and erected in 1993. So when you think about the dates here, Vietnam Veterans Memorial, I think 1980, and then 13 years later getting one for women. We can kind of think about the gender dynamics. The gender dynamics of Tim O'Brien's story is definitely something I want us to think about too. There are very charged moments in the story that you guys read about gender in relation to war. So I wanted to include that image as well. Okay, so in 1980, the American Psychological Association recognized and codified in its Diagnostic Statistical Manual. This is the book that all psychologists go to in order to say, okay, this person has this, this person has this, and it affects whether or not you get payment for treatment. Okay, so it has real economic consequences. They recognize PTSD as a disorder, and since then it's become more inclusive of gendered experience as well. One thing I really want to stress with you guys as we start to move from this into talking about literature is that PTSD does not just relate to war experience. It relates to a range of traumatic experiences such as sexual assault, domestic violence, things that are very embedded here at home. And the statistics show us that these are not just issues that we can think about as being abroad, but these are very embedded in our campuses, in our communities, and so our ethical responses to PTSD are really important, and hopefully we can kind of work through some of the representational issues today. Okay, so I've just given you guys a litany of historical and kind of psychological backgrounds for where trauma comes from. So you're probably thinking to yourselves, okay, Ruth, where does this connect with literature? Because traumatic experience, and I'm working without my notes today, actually, I left them somewhere else, so I had a definition of what PTSD actually says. And what the definition in the book says is that it's something like, it's an overwhelming experience of life-threatening circumstances or perceived life-threatening circumstances in which the person feels helpless or extreme fear. The person relives the experience to a certain extent, so there's something like flashbacks or triggered memories, and then there's an avoidance of any stimuli that would provoke the same kinds of responses. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what PTSD, the definition, stands in the book. So what that definition tells us is that memory is a really perilous issue when it comes to the experience of trauma that intersects how we understand the human dimensions of war, right? Because we're going to get back here to the human dimensions of war and what this helps us understand. So, because as you guys were noting earlier when we were all talking, because memory and facts are so difficult to pin down when we're talking about traumatic experience in general, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, literary scholars started to recognize the special place that literature can play in conveying the otherwise inexpressible feelings that accompany traumatic experience. So whereas you all were noting that an objective, factual narrative about war would be very cut and dry, it would be very general, really not get at the heart of what the war experience was, someone who wants to testify about their traumatic experience isn't going to be able to kind of jump to that kind of narrative to describe what they went through in the experience of war. So, literary narrative becomes a mode through which they can be creative, they can describe, they can testify to what they've been through, and moreover, they can have readers. Someone in here mentioned that empathy was an important aspect of reading a traumatic narrative, that relationship with the reader, the interaction. And that's something I also want us to pay attention to when we turn to the story to think about. What is the interaction or failure of interaction that we see happening in How to Tell a True War Story? So the relationship between reader and writer becomes paramount, and making available to collective memory your experiences that otherwise wouldn't come through in other forms of narrative. So we can kind of think about, I've just put a couple characteristics up here that broadly relate to the way that war trauma or trauma emerges in fiction. Things that you can kind of look for as signposts in literature and ask yourself, how is this functioning? What is it representing? In fiction, trauma tends to make use of unreliable narrators. And I think you guys really had that kind of smack you in the face with the things they carried in terms of the narrator who's telling you a story in this particular piece. And there's also troubled distinctions because war trauma can also shatter one's sense of identity and make it difficult to tell the inside from the outside, I'll say it that way. So what happens in the literary expression often then is that there becomes a troubled dynamic between self and others. And forms of dehumanization also come into play. So I want us to think about the dehumanization going on in the things they carry as well. There's a lot of that. Literary symbols take on a heightened resonance in stories that attempt to convey trauma because memory jumbles kind of clear-cut stories about traumatic experiences to such a degree that an A to Z story becomes difficult. Symbols will stand in for certain feelings, thoughts, experiences. So I want you guys to be attuned to if you see symbols coming into play anywhere in the short story. And then trouble with space and time. So in terms of space, not feeling grounded in a particular location, undecidability about where exactly you are in your setting, and discontinuities in time. So one thing that's kind of a marker right away of stories that are conveying trauma is that you're not going to move in a linear fashion from once upon a time to happily ever after. Okay, not from A to Z. You find yourself moving from maybe N to X to G to L, what have you, jumping all over the place in terms of time. So we can think about how that's expressing a certain kind of dislocation. So I want to try to think about moving now into applying this to Tim O'Brien. I'm not going to give you a ton of background on the things they carry. How many of you guys read this in the full format in high school? Yeah? Okay. It was published in 1990 and kind of quickly rose in a meteoric way to a canonical status within war fiction in the US. And most recently has been recorded for audiobook by Bryan Cranston from Breaking Bad. So if you guys Breaking Bad fans, you can check that out. It contains 22 stories, and I've got a copy here if anyone wants to take a look at the full version. It contains 22 stories or sections. Tim O'Brien is very undecided about whether he wants this to be considered short stories or a work in its integrity that's just broken up. And he was a Vietnam veteran himself, but he's very clear about the fact that his narrator, or the I perspective, right, that you're getting in the story, is not fully mappable onto himself. Okay, so there is distance between O'Brien and the narrator. That's an important ethical distance that he preserves. Any questions about stuff? I'm kind of throwing a lot at you right there. Make sure that everybody's concepts. If at any point you have questions, just go ahead and shout out. All right, so let's actually get into the text now. Let's get into the meat of the issue here. You all have copies of the things they carried with you. And what I'd like you to do at this point is, we've kind of got rows going here, so if you all could congregate in maybe the groups of your rows, if you want to just kind of configure yourselves into groups of 3 or 4, I want you guys collectively to consider a few of the following questions. And I'm going to kind of hop around and listen to the conversations going on, and then we'll kind of come back to the middle here and sum up what your thoughts are about the text. So I included some questions here in the front of your reading that I wanted you to think about in preparation for today's class meeting. But let's move them into a certain direction here and try to link them to some of the concepts that we've learned. So with your group, think about, and you guys can jot these down. Actually, I'm going to change slides because I've got a Wordle that I'm dying to show you. So what moments of how to tell a true war story, based on what you guys have just learned, do you see as expressive of war trauma? Then one that I asked you to think about ahead of time was, why is this a love story? What's going on with that? And love for whom? Because that's important. I'm not feeling the love for everybody in this story. So who are we feeling the love for in this story? And then finally, something else that I asked you guys to think about. What or whom falls outside of the frame of this story? Who do we not see in this world of the Vietnam War? And related to that, where do war stories fail here? That last one's kind of a big question, so we might not be able to fully tackle that, but we can go ahead and start thinking about it. All right, so as you're working, I'm going to put up my little word map here because I'm currently obsessed with visualizing narrative. How many of you guys have used Wordle before? Yeah? Okay. It's a great way to see what words you're prioritizing in the text that you write. So for those of you guys who aren't familiar with it, the words that are used more than others appear bigger on the screen. So as you guys are talking as a group, take a look at the Wordle and see what's most pronounced in the story itself. So go ahead and kind of color yourselves into groups of 3 or 4. I think probably based on the rows, the seat rows here will work well. And I'm going to come around and just work group-wise with you on these questions for a little while. Okay. It wasn't that linear at all.
I know.